Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, listening to this big book telephone workshop or listening to it at some time after the recording is made. This call is being recorded. And I would appreciate your joining me in the set aside prayer. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path in you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Now, please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Welcome to the telephone workshop that's looking at step one. Just as a frame of reference, I approach step one from three different angles, seeing three different parts. The question with regard to the body is, what happens when I start? It's a really simple question, and it's behavioral. It's not thinking, it's not feeling, it's not emotion, it's not knowing, it's not consciousness. It's behavior. What happens when I start? And the only answer is, once we get people focused on the reality of the question and their own personal experience, the only answer is, if you're an addict, I take another drink. I take another drug. I take another bite. I continue to gamble. And the real answer is, I lose control. Once I start, I cannot stop. When you come to the second part, which we will next week, what's wrong with our mind? The only question is, well, why can't you stay stopped? We have lots of skill in stopping, lots of experience in stopping, and we stay stopped for a day, a weekend, a week, a month, a year, or many years. And then we start again. What's that? We'll look at that. Bill talks about obsession and delusion. So that's the first half of the first step, dealing with the inherent deficiency of the body and the inherent deficiency of the mind. Then we cross over the dash to the unmanageability, a completely separate thought by my experience, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. Unmanageability is the problem. Unmanageability is the spiritual malady. And I used the term will there. I think I had you outline that the last time we were on the call together. Admitted we were powerless over alcohol or our addiction. That's really important, and it is a problem. It's just not the problem. The problem is after the dash. And I do believe that's where Bill really meant our way of living may have its advantages for all. All human beings have a deficiency of their will, an inherent deficiency. It's not our fault. We're built that way. In our body, we're built that way. In our mind, we're built that way. In our will, we're built that way. It's a tremendous relief in terms of guilt and shame, because it's really not our fault. And then as we dig down deep into each of these components, we see it's our responsibility. And that's really the conundrum. It's a paradox. We're powerless in our body, we're powerless in our mind, we're powerless in our will, and yet we're fully responsible, meaning to deal with it, to deal with the addiction is as it manifests in the craving. To deal with the addiction as it manifests in the repetitive loss of ability to stay stopped and relapse. And then Bill says we're not cured in step 10. The repetitive experience of doing what we don't want to do and not doing what we want to do as a human experience. And we're not cured of that, but we do have a daily reprieve. More about that later. So we looked at doctor's opinion. Dr. Silkworth is not an alcoholic. He was the supervisor of the alcoholic and drug ward at Towns Hospital in New York back in the late 20s, early 30s. He was a psychiatrist, a medical doctor with a psychoanalytic training, and a wonderfully compassionate human spirit. He really wanted to help. But he failed. 100% failed. Nobody got and stayed sober. And he made the observation that it looks like we're really different. Addicts, alcoholics are really different. They have a problem of the body and a problem of the mind, he said. And he spent a lot of time in his letter, in his opinion, digging deeply into the problem of the body. And we looked at that last week. And we saw, at least if you heard me and if you did the work and you did the reading and you followed my logic and my observation about the book, we saw that Dr. Silkworth uses the word craving in a way that's not defined in the dictionary. The dictionary says a craving is the desire for, the inclination for, the yearning for, the anticipation of. That's craving in the dictionary. But that's not craving in the big book. Dr. Silkworth says very specifically the craving never begins until after we ingest the substance, or in more current terms, engage in the process. There are two forms of addiction: substance addiction, alcohol, drugs, and food, and the process addiction, which is everything else. Addiction being repetitive behavior over which I have no control, which leads to negative consequences. All of those are very important pieces of defining addiction. It's not a scientific definition, it's a behavioral definition. Repetitive behavior over which I lose control that produces negative consequences. And so Dr. Silkworth's very clear opinion is there's something wrong with our body. That when I put the chemical of alcohol into the chemistry of my body, the two chemicals mix in such a way that it doesn't mix like normal people. 1 out of 10 have an abnormal reaction. Abnormal. 9 out of 10 people don't have it. 9 out of 10 people don't have the reaction that perhaps you've experienced with regard to food, where you are allergic to. He uses the term lightly. It's not a scientific term. He's really paralleling with his medical experience as a medical doctor, allergies to, for instance, pollen, or allergies to styrofoam, or allergies to some type of medication, or allergies to fruit, or allergies to shellfish that produce an immediate reaction, a very negative, sometimes fatal reaction. And that's what he's talking about. He's not calling it an allergy. He says it might be something like an allergy. because he really wants to ground it in the physical component, in the body. And this really, if you can hear it and get it and look at your personal experience, brings us to a real experience of no choice. Because he is saying, once I take the drink, or once I take the sugar, or once I take the flour into my system, it's the chemical of the substance that interacts with the chemical of my body, and it triggers this compulsion to put more of the chemical in my body. We've lost control. We've lost choice. It's not about consciousness. It's not about feeling. It's not about awareness. It's not about knowledge. Once I engage or ingest the substance or the process, it triggers the event and I've lost control. Now, the mitigating circumstance with me, which might be helpful to some of you, it is normally when I'm talking in public, is that that's just not my experience every time. Personally, I was not yet a chronic alcoholic. I could have a drink and go back to work. I could have a drink and go home. I could have a drink and have dinner. I could not have a drink regularly, but periodically, I didn't go back to work. I didn't go home. I didn't eat dinner. I lost control periodically. Now, the disease is a progressive disease, so as we engage in it over time, the intervals between the periodic get shorter. And I saw that in my own personal history once I began doing some autobiographical inventory. Over a 20-year drinking period time frame, the periods of losing control were more frequent progressively, and probably would have become chronic had I continued. So keep in mind the distinction. Once I start, I lose control. It's not about thinking. It's not about feeling. It's not about desiring. It's not about wanting. It's not about longing for. It has nothing to do with before. It has everything to do with after. After I take the drink, after I take the bite, after I make a decision to go to the drug dealer, as I understand it, not my experience. The chemicals in my body begin to release whatever it is they release, and my cellular structure demands more of the chemical, and I've lost control. It's a biological mandate. It's a biological imperative. Those two words are not in the big book, mandate and imperative. I use them to give a sense of the power of the loss of control. But I use the term biological because it's not a decision. It's a chemical reaction. I think we've gotten that one really clearly. Well, then we go on to Bill's story. And I asked you to read pages 1 through 8, and we will look at those specifically today when we have our conversation with one another. And the real point of this is to take a look at Bill's story in terms of identification. Can you identify with how he thought, how he felt, how he behaved, how he drank? There's lots of dimensions here. Of course, you can't, some of you, identify with him as a male because you're a female. Of course, you can't identify any of you with a stockbroker in the 1920s and 30s, of course, because that's who he was then, and that's not who you could in fact be. So identifying with these particular ingredients, how we thought and felt and behaved and drank, will help us begin to identify the ingredients of an addict. And then watch his progression from a social drinker, basically. When he started, he was in uniform, World War I. And then he is completely out of a job by page 8, a certainly distilled version of his story. But we see the progression and the disintegration over time as he relapses and tries and relapses and tries. All of the failed attempts, his experience of loss of control, his experience of stopping, even getting some therapy from Dr. Silkworth in 1933. He went into the hospital. And then 3 times in 1934, September, November, and December, he was hospitalized, dried out, got the cure, and went out and got drunk. The times that he was, in fact, going to the Oxford group meetings there in late 1934, going there drunk or after the meeting getting drunk, and realizing that he was just hopeless. And that page 8 describes his bottom. We'll take a look at that as we talk to each person. I'll have you look at each page, and we will review your perception of your highlights, my perception of my highlights, and we'll kind of scan each page to see if there's some opportunity to share knowledge and or experience with that page. Finally, Ebby rings him. We're stopped there on page 8 where he gets a phone call from Ebby, but the point here is Ebby had had some exposure to his drinking. He was a drinking buddy. Ebby was now sober in the Oxford group. The 6th step of the Oxford group is to reach out and help somebody else have the experience that you've had in terms of a spiritual experience, spiritual awakening. And that's what Ebby was doing. The point is, he reached out to Bill, a proactive act of compassion. We don't wait for somebody to ask us for help. Now, circumstances will dictate the common sense of that, but I'm pointing out that it's a good thing that Ebby didn't wait for Bill, that Ebby was very proactive. And in fact, we'll see later on in step 2, when we look at the balance of Bill's story, Ebby actually visited him in the hospital in that 3rd hospitalization and took him through the steps on his 2nd day of detox. And on his 3rd day of detox, Bill had his spiritual awakening, pages 13 and 14 respectively. And you will see that when we get there, or you can look at that on your own. And then pages 17 to 23 are the final pieces of the suggested reading. And there are some areas that we'll look at specifically. But the whole point of that section is to bring really a full description and closure to the discussion on the problem of the body, that we really do need help. And the chapter that contains pages 17 to 23 is called There Is a Solution. So although Bill tries to create an atmosphere of hopelessness and desperation, he will pepper it with hope and light and not just darkness. So that in fact we're motivated to do this work because of the hopelessness, but we're also motivated to do this work because we can see just at the end, there's a crack in the darkness and a little bit of light shows through. He talks about addiction not being the problem, that a relationship with God is the solution. And it really depends on our attitude about it all, our attitude of willingness. That's the key mantra throughout the big book, really underscored in step 2, where he calls willingness the cornerstone. Willingness, the cornerstone, the first stone placed on the foundation of our hopelessness. Willingness to take action sets the direction of the building of the entire spiritual arch through which we walk to a new freedom. He also talks about different types, because the patterns are not the same. We're not cookie cutter addicts. I suggested I was a periodic and my wife was a chronic. In the last 5 or 10 years, she drank every day. And she drank every day until she passed out. It wasn't what she wanted to do. God knows she tried therapy and religion and even AA, and it was not working. She finally made a decision to go into a hospital treatment program because she needed that kind of intensive and professional intervention. February 1984. Not only did she save her own life, she saved the life of the family. As you probably know from some other comments that I've made or other exposures that you've had to my work, I was given the gift of freedom from alcohol on February 21st because they asked me to stop drinking to support her recovery, and that was the willingness that I look back on now, that followed by the action that they took, a story for a different day. So on page 22, Bill really just confirms it then, this phase of our assignment, that the body is the problem. It's the initial problem. But he also poses the question, if the body were the only problem, then stopping would be the solution. If what you're doing is creating suffering, just stop it. Well, people who don't have addiction and people with common sense and people with good, strong religious connections and people who are ignorant, quite frankly, will just say no, just stop it. Develop some character, develop some willpower. And you've said it to yourself. And you have character, and you have willpower, and you have outreach to professional intervention. And it didn't work, it wasn't effective. I can stop, but I can't stay stopped. And that takes us to the next assignment, of course. The next assignment is to take a look at assignment 4, which is what's wrong with my mind. There are 4 items in assignment 4. There's no rush. We'll be on assignment 4 for at least a couple workshops. As part of the conclusion to assignment 3, it asks you to complete the worksheet on the body in the Way of Life document. And it's not a test. Please don't approach it like there's correct answers. Nobody's going to grade it. Nobody's going to look at it unless you share it with somebody. And at some point, I will be suggesting that you review it with your sponsor or your step guide. Somebody where you can read it out loud. But meanwhile, write it as if you're not going to share it with anybody. Be radically honest with yourself, but look specifically at your history. This is not a fill in the blanks. This is not get the right answer. This is to hold the question in the milieu of the prayer set aside and ask yourself, what's my experience when I start? Did it happen more than once, twice, 3 times, 100 times? What is my specific, particular experience with sugar, with wheat, with nuts, with berries, with quantity, with quality, different occasions? What is my specific autobiography of my relationship to food in your case? Or any other addiction that might be hinting itself in the whack-a-mole sense. We get a handle on one area of addiction and something else pops up. It's classic in Alcoholics Anonymous, that they get abstinence from alcohol and they develop an addiction in pornography, or with food, or with exercise, or with work, or some other of the multiple addictions that are on the table right now. But so keep in mind that it's to give you an experience of your own with regard to the phenomenon of craving. What happens after you ingest the substance? Thank you so much. It's what we got for today, and I look forward to hook up next week to continue this work. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.